Hello and welcome everyone to another session of History Bytes. In the last session, you will recall that I had actually promised to start unpacking the constitutional contestations around the first Constituent Assembly of Pakistan. But seeing that now we are in the midst of the 27th Constitutional Amendment, I wanted to draw a little bit from history to contextualize what we are seeing in Article 243 of the Constitution that revolves around two essential issues. The first of these has to do with the internal command structure of the armed forces themselves in very broad terms, and the second one has to do with civil military relations, in particular, the question of the extent and nature of civilian control over the armed forces. I don't think it would be far fetched to suggest that part of the story of the origins of 243 lies in the lessons that were learned from both the 1965 and 1971 wars. In December 1971, when power was finally transferred from the martial law regime of General Yahya Khan to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who became the president and civilian martial law administrator of Pakistan, there was a raging debate in the country. This debate, which also attracted a lot of political opposition, had to do with the question of why martial law was continuing after the war had ended with India. And lots of motivations and allegations have actually been imputed to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto for continuing martial law and for not convening the elected assembly till as late as April 1972. Now, there are several reasons why martial law continued several weeks, even months after the transfer of power, and I'm not going to go into those details. But one really important need at the time was to assert political control over the military and the defense services. We know now that there was relentless pressure on Bhutto to bring Yahya Khan and other members of his junta to account for the military debacle of 1971. Bhutto circumvented a direct confrontation with the military on this by instituting a kind of a judicial war inquiry commission that was to be chaired by then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Hamoud Rahman. The Hamoud Rahman Commission, as it came to be known, was formed by Bhutto only days after his assumption of the presidency to investigate, and I quote, the circumstances in which the Commander East Command surrendered and the members of the armed forces of Pakistan under his command laid down their arms and a ceasefire was ordered along the borders of West Pakistan. End quote. The authorized ambit of the Commission's inquiry was clearly circumscribed, as you can tell, but the entire emphasis at the time was on the circumstances of the military surrender. Although the Chief Justice would subsequently broaden the scope of the inquiry of his own accord, I think that the prompt formation of the Commission enabled Bhutto to deflect the question of military accountability to the court, and thus when Bhutto was questioned about prosecuting Yahya and his generals, he replied that he did not wish to prejudice the work of the Commission and that his government would consider further action after the conclusion of the inquiry. Now, Bhutto's strategy to deflect the question of prosecuting Yahya and his generals was not entirely successful because a few weeks later, in around February or March of 1972, Bhutto alleged that the serving commander in chief, who was Lieutenant General Gul Hassan Khan and Air Marshal A. Rahim Khan, were both obstructing the work of the commission. So, this led him to replace these with men that Bhutto himself believed would cooperate with his government in subordinating the military to civilian authority. And so, resultantly, these two gentlemen were replaced by General Tikka Khan, who became the new commander in chief, and Zafar Chaudhry, who became the air marshal. It was only after President Bhutto had reshuffled power within the military that he then moved to lift martial law and convene the elected assembly in April 1972. Now, President Bhutto's next move was to abolish what he referred to as the anachronistic and colonial designation of Commander in Chief and some of the imperial privileges associated with it, and then to replace it with a more neutral chief of staff for all the three service chiefs. The most important implication of this reorganization was a fixed tenure for the service chiefs, which the president declared would help to wipe out Bonapartism in the armed forces. Now, initially, this tenure was 4 years, but it was reduced in 1975 to 3. And another important change that followed was the creation of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Committee, which was a body that comprised all three service chiefs and whose chairmanship was also to rotate among the three services. Now, there were two big reasons behind this particular change. One of these was obvious. It was to facilitate joint command, a lesson that had been learnt, as I said, from both 65 and 71. But more than that, I think at this time, it was a strategy to dilute the preponderant decision making power of the army in the armed forces. Now, as you can tell, the amended Article 243, amongst other things, really erases the reforms that were brought about in the internal command of the armed forces post 1971. Now, the implications of this amendment are clear. What we see is that the army chief has really become the preponderant authority over the entire armed forces and now is also singularly responsible for the joint command of those forces. So essentially, we've gone back to the pre 1971 status quo, where the army chief was the commander in chief. Now, moving on to the second issue of civilian control of the military, this is a really interesting debate that actually happens in the National Assembly during the process of constitution making. What is really important to grasp is the context within which these debates happened. So essentially, there was a larger framework that had been proposed by the PPP in late December of 1972 after all the constitutional negotiations had happened and the debate was about to be started in the Assembly. The PPP, in its draft constitution, took the stance that the Prime Minister would be the actual office in which executive power would be fully located. So, in that sense, there was an appending of the constitutional order that Pakistan had known since 1947, in which the president typically held at least a significant amount of political power, if not in its entirety in practice. The PPP's solution to this historical problem of executive power and executive overreach by the president was to relocate executive power in the office of the Prime Minister, who would be a directly elected representative of the people. The opposition, on the other hand, saw in this a recipe for the Prime Minister to concentrate all power within his person. And this particularly had something to do with the struggle that was carrying on at the time between Pakistan People's Party, which was the party at the center and the ruling majority, and the National Awami Party that represented the Northwest Frontier Province, as it was then called, and Balochistan. This power tussle between the PPP and the NAP on the question of the balance of power between the president and the prime minister also interestingly reflected on the question of the civilian control of the armed forces. So it was actually NAP in coalition with a larger opposition force known as the United Democratic Front that composed largely of right-wing parties that proposed that the president's decision-making and appointment powers be enhanced, including the discretionary power to appoint the Chief Justice and the Chief Election Commissioner, and also that the president be designated the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. Ultimately, a compromise was struck in the original 1973 Constitution. On the one hand, the president would be empowered to raise and maintain all defense forces, to grant commissions in the forces, and to appoint all the chiefs of staff and determine their salaries and allowances. However, the control of the armed forces was to vest with the federal government. That clearly meant the Prime Minister in cabinet. So, just to wrap up, now we haven't really discussed other provisions in the 27th Constitutional Amendment that deal with the immunity that has been granted to the military leadership, to say nothing of the immortality, in fact, that comes along with this particular articulation of 243. But having said that, I don't think that the constitutional form itself can fully determine the civil military relations when it comes to the command and control of the armed forces. That yet remains to be seen. However, one must understand that the Chief of Defense Forces, as he is now called, is basically a colonial commander in chief, and that spells a whole lot of consequences for the military when it is actually in a state of war. Thank you for watching. Take care.
I've already taken certain action, strong action, which no ordinary man would have taken tonight, in removing some of the fat and flabby generals.